at our church? Probably you did, right? Do not be conformed. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. Do not be conformed. Now, these words from Paul are well-used ones here at church. It's a popular benediction. I was trying to remember whether I did it last week reflexively or not. And a popular preaching text, too. I give charges to people who are getting ordained, for example. And back when I would preach a very short sermon on Reformation Sunday, it was also the reading frequently then, too. And that may be fairly easy to understand because it's the sort of thing we like to say to kids at important moments in their lives. Don't conform. Reach for the stars. Live your dreams. That sort of thing. But the fact is, in the context of this church and ones like it, this idea of nonconformity, of dissent, by way of intentional, even willful transformation through the process of constant renewal, that idea is the central engine of our faith. In a sense, this one sentence encapsulates the outlook of many of the groups historically or spiritually connected to the radical Reformation. Do not conform to this world, Paul says, or do not internalize its ways, and do not be afraid to go your own way. In fact, he also says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Always challenge your assumptions. Always challenge the assumptions of others. Always seek that ultimate truth that is dimly understood. Now, of course, this seeking after transformation is in some sense an individual activity, and individuals rarely come to exact same conclusions. So the inheritors of the radical Reformation come in many different forms. And some of those movements are probably familiar to you. Groups like the Mennonites, the Amish, the Unitarians, and others may sound strange, at least to some of us. The Hutterites, the Schwenkenfelders, and perhaps even not the Baptists, but the Anabaptists. If you add in dissenting groups whose historical connection to the early movement may be a little weak, but whose intellectual, cultural, and spiritual connection is strong, the Universalists, for example, or the Swedenborgians, one ends up with a large number of schools of thought, each with overlapping beliefs and a wide variety of disagreements. Some of those groups are very conservative. Others are very liberal. Most of them are kind of in between, both conservative and liberal at the same time. And each movement is supported by a dizzying array of institutions. In fact, it may actually be hard to imagine how such disparate groups would have anything in common. But in each case, we agree on the same impulse. We rely on the instinct for continued questioning. Calvin, Luther, and their followers did, in fact, break new ground in the study and practice of religion. They redefined what it meant to be a person seeking meaning in life, and that is a big deal. However, once those big shards of the stained glass window found something that worked for them, they attempted to solidify their beliefs, to build their own orthodoxies, and dominate discussion. In some places, they succeeded. They succeeded in replacing the Roman Catholic Church and became their own state church. Even so, they couldn't get that genie to go back in the bottle they opened. So Lutheranism and Calvinism and the Orthodox Reformed tradition were unable to recreate for themselves the monolithic system they had fought so hard to break away from. And this fact, this simple historic fact, left a tiny but precious amount of breathing room for the radical Reformation, for hearts and minds unsatisfied with resting on the authority of other human beings, and knowing the tendencies of the larger, more powerful forms of Christian thought, they sought protections for themselves and for each other. Because of this historical fact, this need for protection, these communities of radical reformers also tend to share something else, namely a belief in the freedom of religion. Our reading today from 1568, which is a long time ago, says that in every place the preachers shall preach and explain the gospel, each according to the preacher's understanding of it. And if the congregation likes it, that is well. But if not, it goes on, no one shall compel them, for their souls would not be satisfied, but they shall be permitted to keep a preacher whose teaching they approve. The absence of compulsion, of course, in the radical Reformation led to an even more diversification. And after a while, freedom of religion became an accepted part of many governments, including our own. It's why the Amish in many rural parts of the Northeast are allowed to live the way they do. It's also why religious belief cannot be a reason to ban someone from this country. Now, there are differences, of course, within the radicals. For some reformers, those words from that same declaration, no one will compel them, represents a secular, governmental truth that has no impact on lived theology. However, at least in our part of the radical Reformation, the various forms of progressive Congregationalism, the Universalists, and the Unitarians whose spiritual ancestors actually wrote those particular words, for us, it is also a driver of faith. It is the general communitarian rule that allows us to continue to not conform and continue to be transformed, to question, to study, to grow, to follow our minds and interests where they lead us, to challenge even our own beliefs. This church, this Eliot Church, is steeped in a tradition that is born out of dissent. It started, maybe, with Luther. It certainly was influenced by Calvin. But it continues dissenting up to this day. For many years, one of the denominations we are currently affiliated with, the United Church of Christ, has promoted itself under the phrase, God is still speaking. God is still speaking. By this day, or we, mean that revelation is not something that merely happened in the past, in the time of our ancestors. Instead, it happens today. It happens right now. Too often, Christianity in particular, and other religions in general, are thought of both by adherents and detractors as an assertion of irrefutable facts. Yet this is not the case for us. And Olympia Brown, the star of last year's pageant, tells us to stand by this faith, to work for it, and sacrifice for it. She is not speaking of anything other than the doctrine of universal restoration, teaching that the divine embodies the love of and for all of creation, all of humanity, regardless of humanity's self-imposed divisions, which is to say that she isn't interested in creedal formulas or tests of belief, and neither are we. They restrict our understanding of that which transcends all definition. But instead, she has faith in a God that is love itself and expresses that love in the still, small, ever-changing voice that speaks to us every day. Go on finding ever-new applications of these truths, Olympia Brown tells us, and new enjoyments in their contemplation, always trusting in the one God which ever lives and ever loves. The Act of Religious Tolerance from 1568 tells us that faith is the gift of God. That faith is a gift from God. And since that time, our tradition has grown to understand that faith not as an adherence to a static doctrine, but instead as an intentional openness as we approach the world. Our gift from God is the ability to question, to challenge, to set our new beliefs up against old beliefs, to face down the status quo. So let us take a moment now in silence to consider that attitude of openness and our call to reform and to transform.